You're watching Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Julia Kim. These are the headlines on the continent. The deadline for the junta to install a civilian-led government in Mali passes. But West Africa's regional bloc ECOWAS says it's positive that it will happen in days, not weeks. Calls to free Algerian journalist Khaled Drareni fall on deaf ears. An appeals court sentencing him to 2 years behind bars for his coverage of last year's anti-government protests. And when agriculture meets tech, we'll show you how 2 Tunisian entrepreneurs are using technological innovation to change up the country's vital farming sector. But first, the Tuesday deadline on Mali's military junta to hand over power has come and gone. ECOWAS instead saying it hopes to see a civilian government lead the country, quote, in days, not weeks. The West African regional bloc met in Ghana with the leaders of the junta who seized power last month. ECOWAS also announced that sanctions on Mali would be lifted the minute that leadership is put in place. Nicolas Jamin has the latest developments.
In Ghana, regional bloc ECOWAS and the Malian junta found middle ground on some issues. Sources told France 24 that ECOWAS now accepts a transition that would last 18 months. It would lift sanctions if a civilian president and prime minister are designated. On this point, the junta's leader said he would have to consult his allies. ECOWAS would reportedly accept a vice president from the military. The West African bloc said a civilian president would lead to major changes.
Très conscient des difficultés que les sanctions de la CEDEAO pèsent pour le peuple malien. Dès que la transition se met en place, les sanctions seront élevées.
On Tuesday in Bamako, the M5 protest movement held a press conference. They don't agree entirely with the junta but want to remain allies. The M5 told France 24 it was bothered by some of the junta's new advisors.
Mais l'essentiel pour nous était de mettre en garde toutes ces personnes qui, hier encore, étaient opposées au changement ou demandaient le rétablissement du président Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta dans ses fonctions et qui ont rapidement retourné leur veste pour être des conseillers occultes.
The M5 led massive demonstrations against President Keïta for several months. Then on the 18th of August, the junta toppled Keïta, who had led the country for 7 years.
Well, staying in Mali, the country's former president, Moussa Traoré, has died at the age of 83 at his home in Bamako. Traoré seized power in a coup in 1968, 8 years after Mali gained independence from France. He then went on to rule for 22 years until violent protests erupted over the country's economic decline. At least 200 people were killed before he himself was ousted in a putsch in 1991. He was originally sentenced to death, but in the end was pardoned in 2002. An Algerian court has sentenced journalist Khaled Drareni to 2 years behind bars on appeal. Rights groups have denounced the trial as a violation of press freedom. Now, Drareni played a prominent role in covering the country's pro-democracy movement last year. His supporters say his punishment is part of a new government crackdown on dissent. Brian Quinn has this report.
Supporters of Khaled Drareni taking to the streets of Algiers to demand his immediate release, an increasingly unlikely scenario. On Tuesday, the Algerian journalist was sentenced to 2 years behind bars. It was a lightening of the initial 3-year term handed down in August, but for press freedom advocates, it's no cause to celebrate.
When a sentence is totally arbitrary, absurd, violent, 2/3 of it are not better. It remains totally arbitrary.
Drareni's case has been cast as a litmus test for press freedoms in Algeria. The 40-year-old editor and correspondent for French television networks was convicted on charges of inciting an unarmed gathering and endangering national unity during his coverage of the Hirak anti-government protest movement that broke out in February. Those protests led to the resignation of Algeria's longtime president Abdelaziz Bouteflika, but have yet to dislodge a deep-rooted network of military and political elites who have ruled the country since its independence in 1962. Supporters had hoped Drareni's appeal would bring a lenient sentence or even an acquittal. They say the harsh penalty is part of a crackdown aimed at preventing a revival of the protest movement.
ونعتقد بأن هذا النوع من الأحكام إلى جانب أنه يضر بخالد درارني ويظلمه في سجنه يضر بالجزائر بأن خلفية متابعته وإدانته هي خلفيات.
Drareni denies all charges against him. His lawyers say they plan to appeal his latest sentence to Algeria's Supreme Court.
Well, in other news, opposition figures are fuming after Ivory Coast's top court excluded 40 candidates for October's presidential election. It allowed the contested bid of incumbent Alassane Ouattara, but it sidelined two giants of Ivorian politics, his predecessor Laurent Gbagbo and former rebel chief Guillaume Soro. Today, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, which isn't recognised by the country, called on authorities to put Soro back on the ballot. Our correspondent Sam Bradpeace has more.
Out of 44 presidential hopefuls here in Ivory Coast, only 4 have been given the green light to run by the country's Constitutional Council. Among those who did make it onto the ballot, of course, incumbent President Alassane Ouattara, ex-President Henri Konan Bédié, ex-Prime Minister Pascal Affi-Guesson, and an independent candidate, Kwadwo Konan Bertin. Among those who failed to make it onto the ballot, most failed to do so because they were unable to amass enough signatures of support from the public. A new electoral reform says that prospective candidates must obtain the signatures of at least 1% of voters in half of the country's regions.
Yesterday, they told us that some had validated 6 regions and others that they had validated 15. But we have no way to verify this ruling, and there is no recourse. It is not appropriate at all. There is no recourse. It cannot be accepted. You cannot eliminate candidates on that basis.
Other names to be excluded from this electoral race are, of course, ex-President Laurent Gbagbo and former rebel chief Guillaume Soro, 2 very popular figures here in Ivory Coast who could potentially have won a significant share of the vote, so their exclusion will probably make things easier for President Ouattara. Now, there is little, or no evidence, I should say, to suggest that the Constitutional Council in any way manipulated its findings in order to help the ruling party, but it's worth noting that senior judges sitting on the council are very close to President Ouattara. He appointed most of them. It's also worth noting that the fewer candidates there are in this race, the easier it will be for Ouattara and the RHDP party. If no single candidate wins an absolute majority in the first round, the contest will go to a second round in which the 2 most popular figures will face off against each other. In this context, opposition figures could rally behind one sole candidate, making things harder for Ouattara. So the less that the vote is split, the better things are for the RHDP.
Sam Bradpeace there reporting to us from Abidjan. Well, finally, in Tunisia, agriculture makes up 10% of the country's GDP. 15% of Tunisians depend on it for their livelihoods. But as in many other countries, climate change, water security and an ageing population are putting stress on the industry. With most farmers in their 50s, entrepreneurs are using technology to transform this labour-intensive sector. Our correspondents bring us this report.
Millions of flies in cages. It's an unusual kind of breeding for this French-Tunisian startup Next Protein. They're raising these insects and transforming them into protein for animal feed.
On transforme ces insectes-là en 3 produits essentiellement. 2 produits qui sont destinés à l'alimentation animale, ce sont de la farine protéinée et de l'huile. Et on a un 3e produit qui sont des déjections d'insectes, c'est un fertilisant organique qui peut être destiné au maraîchage, à l'agriculture.
After 6 years of work and in the middle of a lockdown, the startup was able to raise more than 10 million euros to switch to industrial production for export. Their selling point is offering an essential ingredient for sustainable animal food that also helps the environment.
Donc, ce que l'on fait, ce que l'on donne à manger aux insectes, c'est qu'on récupère des fruits, des légumes, des végétaux qui sont issus du gaspillage humain et on réintroduit ça dans la boucle, dans le cycle alimentaire.
This breeding also requires very little water, at a time when Tunisia has been suffering from dry spells in recent years. Yasser Bououd co-founded Azera, a startup which aims to manage farming plots through software that captures data from ground sensors.
De voir sur PC, par exemple, sur ordinateur, tous les cycles tous les temps d'irrigation, le calendrier d'irrigation, toutes les quantités de produits injectés par parcelle.
In this orange orchard, the farmer automates irrigation like this to avoid any waste.
L'agriculteur est obligé de bien gérer est-ce qu'il y a des fuites ou pas de fuites d'eau. Mais malheureusement, avec les grandes distances de lignes d'irrigation qu'on utilise, des gouttes à gouttes, l'agriculteur il est incapable de faire ça manuellement. Donc on utilise la machine, c'est l'ordinateur qui va faire les contrôles.
68 farms have opted to use this new digital farming technique, an encouraging start for the new agricultural startup sector in Tunisia.
And that's it from us. There's more world news coming up here on France 24. Stay tuned.